Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, chapter 2, Halacha 6. This will be a two-part shir. This is part 1 of the shir, and in the art scroll we're on 18b1. Now we're going to get into, there's two topics that's going on here. In the last Mishnah, we were talking about planting a row of flax between your wheat field and at the border of the field belonging to someone else. And the idea is that you're not really going to harvest this flax. You're not even maintaining it. You're just testing the soil. Now, Rabbi Yossi is saying that you can plant this even inside of your own field. And the rabbis are saying, no, if you're going to be doing a test thing that you're not actually going to be maintaining, you're not actually going to be harvesting, you have to do that at the edge of the field so there's no Mars Ein problem. And everybody can clearly see that you're just testing the field to see if the ground is going to be good for growing flax. Now, the Mishnah is going to move to a different concept on other kinds of crops. And part 1 of this shir is going to be talking about more on the Rosh Tor. By the way, the Tor that we talked about for jewelry, that's going to show up in Shir shiurim. So it's a very ancient thing about this triangle. And then part 2 of the shir is going to be talking about what happens if you're growing on dried ground. You have regular ground that you've been planting and it's nice and moist, and then you have a visually distinctive field that's going to be arid and dry. That's going to be basically a visual marker so that if you're planting over there, you could see on some of these Kilayim things. Now keep in mind, the laws on Kilayim are very, very rigid, and a lot of these are coming down as halacha Moshe Sinai. So it takes a lot of work to try to get at this and try to understand what's going on. The Mishnah is going to start off, and it's going to say that we may not plant mustard or haria alongside a field of grain. What is haria? Well, the Gemara is going to explain what it is. It's safflower. Safflower is one of the oldest types of crops in the world. It was actually used by the ancient Egyptians as well, and the ancient Chinese. And for the ancient Egyptians, it was used for mummification, and it was also used all throughout the Middle East as for dye. It made a nice yellow dye, and also it was used for creams and sort of ointments and medicines. So today they're going to be using it as safflower oil. When you go to the market, you buy safflower oil, but back then they were using it for clothing dye and also for cosmetics. And it's one of the oldest crops that we have, that human beings have, and they've been planting it an awfully long time. So planting mustard or haria alongside a field of grain, you may not do it. Mishnah says even if the intention is merely to determine whether it is suitable as a field. So it continues and says, however, we may plant mustard or haria alongside a field of vegetables, provided that the intention is not to harvest that crop and only to test if it's suitable for the field. I want to bring up and highlight something. In the laws of Kilayim, the vegetables is going to be treated more leniently in a lot of these cases. So if you're doing a test field next to a field of vegetables, again, you're not going to be planting it to keep it. You're just testing it. You're going to be allowed to do that next to vegetables, but you can't do that alongside the grain. Now, the Mishnah's case regarding the flax, that's going to deal with an owner who's going to be, there's like concerns that the owner who's going to sow mustard or haria is really just trying to test the ground. And he's going to have to uproot it, and he even wants to uproot it before it comes and makes these seeds. Now, by biblical law, this kind of planting is allowed because the law of Kilayim is going to be where both species are intended for harvest. But the nuance here is not if one of them is just a temporary planting. So by rabbinic law, such a planting is going to be prohibited. Why? The rabbis are worried that an observer might not realize that the planting is just intended as a test, and therefore they banned it as a Mars Ein issue. Now, this decree by the rabbis was stated only where there is at least a possibility that the crop was intended to remain until maturity. But where the crop was definitely sown as a test, even this decree does not apply. And an example of this crop being discussed in the last one, which is going to be flax, that, if allowed to reach full growth, is actually going to be damaging the adjacent crop. And thereby, it's instantly understood by observers that it's only a test and it's going to be uprooted. Why is it clear to everybody it's just a test? Because if the guy leaves it in his field, it's going to damage the crops that are next to it. That's going to be the nature of what happens when you're dealing with the flax. And that's why you have this ruling over there on flax. But this mission is adding the example of the mustard and the haria. That's going to be the safflower. And it says that it can be planted alongside the vegetables. And these plants are also going to be known to damage vegetables growing nearby. And therefore, somebody who observes the presence alongside those vegetables with the mustard or the safflower is going to realize that they were planted as a test. Now, we see this in other halachot in I guess it's in Baba Batra. So in I think it's Baba Batra, that it talks about damages in property that's next to each other. So in the case of having my property next to your property, and I'm growing something that's commercially has to be a certain way, and you're going to be trying to be a honey farmer, and I'm going to be trying to grow mustard, and you're going to be trying to get honey, and I want my mustard sharp, and you want your honey sweet, and they're saying that you can't put the two next to each other because you're going to end up with spicy, sharp honey. It's going to ruin the honey. And the same worry is going to be over here if you're planting mustard next to some of these like squash and other kinds of vegetables, that it might come and throw off the taste, so that or maybe it's just going to damage the crop altogether. So grain, by contrast, is not going to be damaged by mustard or haria. So an observer who goes and sees these crops next to each other is going to assume that it's for harvest. But because apparently there's a farming thing that if you're planting vegetables next to mustard, it's going to ruin the vegetables. So everybody's going to know that you're just testing it out to see if mustard would be a good crop there, and they know that you're not suicidal about your own pocketbook. You're not going to keep this there until maturity, and that's why they're going to be allowing it, because it's really not in your self-interest to let it mature, and really everybody's going to see it's just a test. Now, the Mishnah is going to be contrasting grain and vegetables, and the Chazan Ish points out that grain might also, by the way, include kitniyot and legumes and rice and sesame. So that's when we're talking about grain, we're talking about that sort of category. So the next section is really going to be the next set of laws that are different from these sets. And the Mishnah is teaching the law of various separations that are going to allow diverse species to be sown next to each other. So it says, the Mishnah says, one may plant diverse species alongside uncultivated land, plowed land, an unmortared stone wall, a road, a fence that is 10 tefachim high, a ditch that is 10 tefachim deep and 4 tefachim wide, a tree that covers the ground with its branches, and a boulder that is 10 tefachim wide and 10 tefachim high and 4 tefachim wide. Basically, these are all going to be items that separate between diverse species. Now, the Mishnah stated that in this Gemara, we may not, we're moving on to the Gemara, the Mishnah stated that we may not plant mustard or haria alongside the field of grain, and the Gemara wants to know what is haria, and the Gemara answers and says, what is haria? It says safflower. So the Mishnah now is going to be stating that mustard or safflower can't be planted alongside a field of grain. And the Gemara is going to actually amend that ruling. And it says, this is what the Mishnah actually said. We may not surround a field of grain with mustard and safflower, but with regard to whether we may plant these crops alongside grain, the law is that we may indeed plant them alongside the grain, provided that our intention is only to determine if the crop is suitable for this field. So again, you're not trying to hold on to this. Now, according to the way this is, there's a worry if you're surrounding your crop with safflower or mustard. And the Mishnah is ruling that where the inner crop is grain, this kind of sowing is forbidden. Why? Because the grain is not harmed by these plants. So an observer is going to assume that they were intended to remain until maturity, and their presence is going to be a Maris Ein issue. So the rabbis are decreeing that they are prohibited. But if you have the inner crop being vegetables, which are subject to damage by mustard and safflower, then that sowing is going to be prohibited. Why? Because the observer is going to know that these were just planted for a test. So this is not going to be included in this rabbinic decree. So the Gemara is going to infer that if the mustard or the safflower does not surround the grain and it just adjoins it, the sowing is permitted. This is because these plants, although not damaging to the grain, do possess some slight capability to inflict damage. And where they surround the grain, the rabbis ignore the possibility of damage, which is very small, and apply the decree. Now, this configuration is generally going to be treated more stringently in terms of the laws of Kilayim, but the rabbis treated it stringently here as well. So in the case of having mustard or safflower, that's going to be alongside a grain field, but does not surround the grain field, the decree does not imply. That's going to be the less stringent configuration, and that's going to be because when you look at the possibility of damage, it's going to impel the rabbis to waive the decree in this case. So accordingly, says Rabbi Kanievsky, one is permitted to sow mustard or safflower alongside grain in order to test the field. Now, this is basically that you're not trying to let this come to fruition, and you're not trying to actually get the safflower seeds out of it or the mustard seeds out of it. You're just doing a test. So the Gemara is going to cite a brisa that records a four-way dispute regarding the prohibition to surround crops with mustard and safflower. And the Gemara identifies one of the brisa's disputants as the Tana of the Mishnah. And the Gemara says that our Mishnah accords with the view of Rabbi Yehuda, for it was taught in a brisa that we may surround only with hasayos. Now, what are going to be hasayos? Hasayos are, says the Mara Fulda, and this is from Tosefta and Trumos 9.3, that they are sharp-flavored vegetables like onions, garlic, and leek. So it says that from the brisa we may surround only with hasayos, which again are onion, garlic, and leeks, with a test planting of mustard or safflower, but not with any other crop. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is basically going to have the opinion, as the Chazan Ish explains it, that the only vegetables susceptible to damage from mustard and safflower are hasayos, which are onion, garlic, and leek. The other vegetables are not harmed by these plants. So he's narrowing it in, as the Chazan Ish explains it, that most vegetables may not be surrounded with mustard and safflower, even if one's intention is merely to test whether they're suited for this field. Why? Because we're worried that it will be assumed that they are intended to remain until maturity. And one is permitted, however, to surround the hasayos, in other words, the onion field, the garlic field, or the leek field, with mustard or safflower. Why? Because it's understood that it's going to damage these plants, and it's really just a test. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda says we may surround any crop with a test planting of mustard or safflower, with the exception of grain. So this is actually going to be what the Mishnah rules. And since mustard and safflower are damaging to the vegetables, the idea is that we may surround a field of vegetables with these crops in order to test it for, to see if it's good for planting in this land. And why is that? Because, since they're not going to be damaging to grain, we may not surround the grain with it as a test because it's a Maris Ein problem. It has the appearance of wrongdoing. So it looks like Rabbi Yehuda is the Tana of this Mishnah, and the next opinion is going to be, in this four-way dispute, Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says that we may surround any crop with a test planting of mustard or safflower. So that's really very makel. That means that even grain can be surrounded, according to Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Kanievsky explains about this that Rabbi Shimon holds that these plants are sufficiently damaging to grain, albeit a very small amount, that an observer will recognize that they're planted for testing only. And basically because they're sufficiently damaging, even though a small amount, to grain, he's going to permit them to be sown in a grain field for this testing purposes. And then you have the fourth opinion, which is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who says in the case of small patches of vegetables, we may surround them with a test planting of mustard or safflower, but we may not surround other crops with these plants. So the Pnei Moshe says about this that it is not a common practice to surround a small patch of vegetables with mustard or safflower. And Rabbi Kanievsky adds in his commentary that an observer is going to assume that they were planted in order to test the ground, and that's why it's going to be permitted, because, again, it's not common practice to surround a small patch of vegetables with mustard or safflower. So another way to look at this is that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is holding that these plants cause damage only to small patches of vegetables and not full fields. But regardless of how you're going to read this, even if you're going to say that it's not usual to surround a small garden patch with safflower, and then you really are trying to show that you're just testing the field, basically you're trying to show that in this case it's not a normal practice, and you're not intending to keep the crop. Again, d'oraita, you can't harvest two of these crops that are situated next to each other. But, in this case, we're testing it, and we don't have any intention of harvesting the test crop whatsoever. So the Gemara now is going to discuss the conditions where someone is permitted to plant a row of mustard or safflower in a grain field. And I actually spent a lot of time on this sugya. So the Gemara says that they taught in a brisa that a person is permitted to plant in his grain field a row of mustard or safflower without separating between the species. And the Gemara says, provided that he makes the length of the row 10 1/2 amot in length by its full width. So what this brisa is saying, this is going to be Tosefta 2:4. This is referring not to a planting that is going to be for harvest. This is only going to be to test the land. This is, a continuation. And, again, this is not a permanent planting. And, again, you're not actually trying to get mustard seeds. You're not actually trying to get safflower to grow here to maturity. You are just doing a test. So what is going to be the condition if you have a grain field and now you want to do a test for mustard, and do it in a way where it's not going to be Kilayim and you're not going to have a Maris Ein issue? So it says that person is permitted to plant in his grain field a row of mustard or safflower without separating between the species, provided that he makes the length of the row 10 1/2 amos in length by its full width. Now, this basically is referring to a bet rova. Now, the Gemara here, like the Tosefta in 2:7, is going to be saying 10.5 amos, and actually the real measurement, as the Rambam explains, is going to be 10.2 amos square. By the way, the Rosh has 10 amos by 10 amos, and by 2.5 tefachim. But anyway, the Tosefta is saying 10.5, and so let's just say that they're keeping it easy, and by the way, a little bit bigger than what the bet rova really would be, so it's really very lenient on it. And basically, it'd be very easy for a farmer or somebody who doesn't have like measuring tools to come up with a space of 10.5 almost. That's going to be easier to determine than 10.2 almost. So it's going to be rounded up a little bit to make it a little bit more lenient. But anyway, it's basically talking about the measurement of a bet rova. Remember, a bet rova is going to be 1/24 of the bet sa'ah. Bet sa'ah is going to be 24 out of 24 rovaim, which is going to be the amount of land that qualifies for a grain field or an orchard, field of trees, and this is going to correspond to 1/2 the temple courtyard. Temple courtyard is going to be 50 amos by 100, and here the regular bet sa'ah is going to be 50 by 50, and so 2 bet sa'ahs is going to be the size of the temple courtyard, very agadic and deep, that the plants like the grain or the kitniyot or the trees, if you're going to try to maximize seed yield and maximize nutrition, also with trees, is going to be corresponding in some way to the temple courtyards. Very deep, very beautiful. So over here, we're talking about trying to fit in a mustard strip or a safflower strip. And how is this going to be possible? Because we just learned you can't plant these next to each other, right? Well, this is going to be how it's done. So the Gemara is going to qualify this Bryce's permit, because without explaining it, we know that you can't do this. You can't take a mustard strip and plant between a grain field with it. So how is this going to be? So Rabbi Lazar says that they did not teach the permit of a 10.5 amma row of mustard or safflower, except in the case of a small field of grain. But in the case of a large field, no one may plant a row of mustard or safflower without distancing it from the surrounding field. So again, if you're going to be doing a bet sa'ah of your field, and you're going to be trying to say, well, I want to do my mustard strip right in the middle of my wheat field, you're not allowed to do it unless you now go and you make a series of setbacks to create distance on all sides from the grain, so that now you've basically split up the wheat field into 2 wheat fields and 1 mustard field, and there's going to be work strips and walking strips and distancing strips between the grain, the mustard, and the grain. So the key is that if you're doing it on a big field, you have to create distancing. But again, now we're talking about this small field that is going to be a bet rova. What is going on over here? And the Gemara is going to be asking and say, what field is considered large and what field is going to be considered small? And the Gemara is going to explain and say that if between the last stalk on one and on one end of the field and the last stalk on the other end, there's at least a bet rova, this is a large field. But it does not measure a bet. But if it does not measure a bet rova, this is a small field. So the size of the small field is ensuring that the row of mustard, which does measure a bet rova in length, will protrude from the field. And since that row begins outside the field and ends inside, it's going to be permitted under the Rosh Tor rules. So basically what this is saying is, we know that, okay, the field is going to be divided up in theory to 24 parts. That's a halacha Moshe Sinai. We know nullifications will happen in 1 in 24 parts. Okay? So if you have a bet rova now, and you have a measurement inside, which is also going to be a bet rova, okay? And now you're taking a tiny strip of land, and you have a lot of the mustard strip now is planted outside of this grain. Okay, so you have like a mustard strip that is planted clearly outside of this little tiny wheat area. Okay, then basically, since this is so small, it's going to be recognizable that the mustard or the safflower is being grown as a test, and that you have no intention to keep it. And again, because the mustard strip now is going to be longer than the grain field and it's going to extend out, they're going to count it as a leniency for this bet rova field, which is 1/24th of the size of the field. And it's going to have this leniency of the bet tor. And remember, the bet tor has to have where it's extending outside of the field. So even if it's touching, it's going to be okay. Well, this is going to be where part of the strip is inside of it. So how could this all be? Well, again, first of all, this is only a case where you're not intending to harvest the mustard or the safflower. If you were intended to harvest this would be forbidden under Kilayim. So again, you're not harvesting it. You're only trying to get around this Derabanan restriction so that you can do your test. How does the halacha work for you to have this leniency? So one reason that somebody is permitted to plant a row of mustard or safflower in the middle of the grain field is that the row is regarded as a Rosh Tor, and that means that you have this narrow planting that touches or protrudes into a wider one, and a Rosh Tor of one species is allowed to adjoin a field of another species without a separation. But the different configurations distinguish the planting from each other, and therefore it's not Kilayim. In other words, everybody's going to be able to see that this mustard is jutting out from the grain field, and it's not part of the grain field. That's what it's trying to say. Now, why, and I asked the mishkiach of the yeshiva for this, why would it be that you can do this on a small field but not a big field? And his answer was, well, because in a very large grain field, you're not going to be able to distinguish between this 6 tefachim strip of safflower or mustard. It's going to get lost in the field. And it's basically, you're not going to realize that it's there as a test, and it's going to be dafka Kilayim. Even if you're going to now try to harvest it at 2 different times, the problem is it's the only way you can be doing this kind of test with grain is on a very small scale, and the permit is only going to be where a Rosh Tor begins outside of the field and extends to touch the field or protrude into it. So it does not apply where you have a row or a patch and it's going to be entirely surrounded by the field of another. In other words, it has to protrude. And if it doesn't protrude, this is not allowed. This is only a leniency with the Rosh Tor laws because this mustard strip juts out. And the case by Rabbi Lazar is going to be saying that this 10.2 amma row of mustard or safflower is stated regarding a grain field that measures less than that amount. So since the field is less than 10.2 amos, basically going to be a bet rova, the row of vegetables, no matter where it's placed in the field, is going to protrude from the edge of the field. And that's why it's going to be allowed as a Rosh Tor. So it's using 10.2 amos for the mustard or safflower, and it's talking about a grain field that's less than 10.2 amos, and this is basically going to be where everybody can walk by it and see that you're in compliance with this, and that you're trying to keep this separate, and that this is not being a field that's mixed together with 2 different species. So you get the leniency on this by the Rosh Tor laws. Now, the Gemara is going to get into more about this, and the Gemara says, does this Baraisa not contradict the ruling of Rabbi Yochanan? For Rabbi Yochanan said a Rosh Tor that derives from the destruction of a field is prohibited. So, how can this be? How can you have a Rosh Tor now, in this grain field? And, Rabbi Yochanan ruled before, in the last halacha, that the permit of the Rosh Tor is valid only where the Rosh Tor was independently planted and formed as a Rosh Tor, and not where it comes into existence through the destruction of a surrounding field. Now, in this case, the row was independently formed, and it did not come into existence through the destruction of surrounding crops, but it's still not going to be considered a Rosh Tor, according to Rabbi Yochanan, since it was not originally formed as a Rosh Tor. It's just made as an ordinary strip. So the Gemara is going to try to reconcile Rabbi Yochanan's view with the Brisa, and it says there, with regards to Rabbi Yochanan's ruling, the reference to a Rosh Tor is of seeds. But here, regarding the Brisa's ruling, the reference to a Rosh Tor of vegetables. So although Rabbi Yochanan disagrees in the case of seeds with those who allow the Rosh Tor that derives from the destruction of the field, he admits in the case of vegetables that a Rosh Tor may derive from the destruction of the vegetables. So he's basically saying that the Rosh Tor laws for the vegetable is going to be more lenient than for a grain field. And so, seeds here is going to refer to plants primarily grown for this consumption of seeds. That would be like beans and chickpeas and wheat. And vegetables is going to talk about something that you care about for the leaves, like lettuce and cabbage or cucumbers. So what's going on over here? Well, this is talking about, that if Rabbi Yochanan is basically going to be allowing a Rosh Tor only where it protrudes from and is attached to a full-size field. And if the Rosh Tor emerges from an unplanted area, that's not going to be allowed according to Rabbi Yochanan. And this Gemara is pointing out a contradiction to Rabbi Yochanan from this Brisa, whose case concerns a row of vegetables that stands alone and not a protrusion from a larger field of vegetables. But this Brisa is ruling that a row is permitted as a Rosh Tor, and that clearly stands in opposition to the view of Rabbi Yochanan. So the Vilna Goan is going to be understanding this, that the term Rosh Tor formed by destruction of the surrounding field, and this is going to be an interpretation, says the Vilna Goan, that was formed throughout the earlier sugya discussing this, and one encounters difficulty in reconciling this interpretation with this Gemara, and which does not deal with a row formed through the destruction of the surrounding field, but nevertheless still is going to invoke this rule for the Rosh Tor. So, the Vilna Goan is remarking about the difficulty of, this Gemara, and basically he's going to have a different kind of reading on this. So, according to one explanation of this Gemara, when we're talking about this long, narrow row of mustard or safflower, Maraful is going to be saying that although the Gemara discusses not a row, but a patch measuring 10.2 amos on each side, that's going to be permitted because it constitutes a distinct and significant field in its own right. And that's going to be the key concept, is that it's a significant field. And that's going to be clear, when somebody walks by, they're going to clearly see it as a separate planting. It's significant, and that it's not Kilayim. So Rabbi Lazar, according to the Marafulda's explanation, is going to be limiting the permit to a case where the grain field is less than the bet rova. But again, if it's going to measure more than a bet rova, then that's not going to be allowed. Why? Because it's not going to be perceived as a separate planting. And that's, if you have this strip, in the full-sized field that takes up a bet seah, that's going to be part of the issue. It's not, this little strip is not significant enough. And not only that, it's going to look like you actually, decided to plant it that way on purpose, and that it's not going to be a separate planting, and that's why it's going to be forbidden as Kilayim. So in the Mara Fulda's view, the Gemara is going to be, this question about the Rosh Tor is not going to be connected to this ruling, but is actually going to be concerning Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's permit, that you can surround a small patch of vegetables with mustard or safflower, and the small patch is going to resemble a Rosh Tor, and that is going to definitely contradict Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Kanievsky is going to interpret this and say that the Brisa speaks of mustard or safflower that the grower intends to keep in place and maturity. And that's another way to look at it. Another way to look at it by the Chazan Ish is that the mustard or safflower strip is planted as a test, and it's only going to be uprooted shortly, and that's another way to read it. So a little bit difficult in how to interpret it. The next year is going to get into something very interesting on how to plant diverse species in a single field without separating them and how that's all going to work. But we get a lot of merit for trying to dig into these very hard to understand laws that people often run away from because they are knotty and difficult. But it's worth doing. Have a great day.